Edmund Emil Kemper III was an American serial killer who murdered 10 people between 1964 and 1973, including his paternal grandparents when he was 15 years old, 6 young female college students between 1972 and 1973, his mother, and his mother's best friend, earning him the nickname the co-ed killer, because most of his victims were female college students who he picked up while hitchhiking in Santa Cruz County, California, and his crimes included necrophilia, decapitation,
dismemberment, and cannibalism.
The story of Edmund Kemper begins on December 18, 1948, in Burbank, California, where he was born into what would become a deeply troubled family. He was the middle child of 3, with an older sister Susan and a younger sister Ellen. His parents were Edmund Emil Kemper Jr., a World War II veteran who had tested nuclear weapons at the Pacific Proving Grounds after the war before working as an electrician, and Clarnell Elizabeth Stage, a domineering woman from Montana who would become the central figure in Edmund's psychological development. From the very beginning, Edmund was different. He weighed 13 pounds at birth, making him unusually large even as a newborn. By the age of 4, he was already a head taller than his peers, and this physical difference would continue throughout his childhood, making him stand out in ways that contributed to his social isolation and feelings of being different from other children. The Kemper household was not a happy one. Clarnell was an alcoholic with severe emotional problems who constantly criticized and belittled her children, particularly Edmund. She had married Edmund's father after he returned from the war, but their relationship was troubled from the start. Edmund Sr. had survived intense combat in World War II and had participated in nuclear testing, experiences that had left their own psychological scars. However, he later said that living with Clarnell was worse than anything he had experienced during the war, comparing it to suicide missions and saying she affected him more than over 390 days of fighting on the front lines. The toxic dynamic between Edmund's parents created an atmosphere of constant tension and conflict in the home. Clarnell was never satisfied with her husband's job as an electrician, which she considered beneath her social aspirations. She constantly complained about his menial work and made it clear that she felt he was not providing the kind of life she deserved. This created additional stress in the household and contributed to the eventual breakdown of the marriage. As Edmund grew older, the problems in his behavior became more apparent and more disturbing. Unlike normal children who might play with toys or games, Edmund engaged in activities that showed clear signs of psychological disturbance. He had a fascination with death and violence that manifested in deeply troubling ways. One of his favorite games was something he called gas chamber, where he would ask his younger sister to tie him up and pretend to flip a switch. He would then fall over and writhe on the ground, pretending to be executed by gas. He also played a similar game called electric chair, where he would simulate being executed by electric shock. These games were not normal childhood play, but rather early signs of his preoccupation with death and violence. They showed that even as a young child, Edmund was thinking about killing and death in ways that were far from normal. These disturbing games were a preview of the violence that would later define his adult life. Edmund's treatment of animals was another major warning sign that something was seriously wrong. He showed extreme cruelty toward pets and animals, behavior that is now recognized as one of the key early indicators of potential violence in adulthood. When he was a child, the family had a pet cat. Rather than caring for the animal as most children would, Edmund buried the cat alive. After it died, he dug up the corpse, cut off its head, and mounted it on a spike. This level of cruelty toward an animal, particularly a family pet, showed a complete lack of empathy and a disturbing fascination with death and dismemberment. The cat incident was not isolated. Edmund killed a second family cat by cutting it into pieces. These acts of animal cruelty were not impulsive moments of childhood anger, but rather calculated acts of violence that he carried out deliberately. The fact that he killed multiple animals and took trophies from them showed that he was developing patterns of behavior that would later escalate to human victims. Edmund also engaged in disturbing behavior with his sister's dolls. He would perform what he called rituals with them, which involved removing their heads and hands in a systematic way. This behavior was deeply troubling because it showed that he was practicing dismemberment and decapitation, skills he would later use on human victims. The ritualistic nature of these activities suggested that he was already developing the psychological patterns that would drive his later crimes. His relationship with his sisters was complicated and showed early signs of his problematic attitudes toward females. While he was sometimes close to his older sister Susan, he also showed signs of jealousy and resentment toward her. When Susan once teased him about why he did not try to kiss his teacher, Edmund's response was chilling. "If I kiss her, I would have to kill her first." This statement showed that even as a young child, Edmund was already connecting romantic or sexual feelings with violence and death. Edmund also displayed stalking behavior as a child. He would sneak out of the house at night, taking his father's bayonet with him, and go to his second-grade teacher's house to watch her through the windows. This behavior showed that he was already developing the predatory instincts that would later make him such a dangerous killer. The fact that he armed himself with a weapon while engaging in this stalking behavior made it even more disturbing. The problems in Edmund's childhood were made worse by the fact that he was also a victim of sexual abuse. He later revealed that he had been molested by his cousin, an experience that likely contributed to his later sexual dysfunction and his disturbing attitudes toward women and sexuality. This abuse, combined with the emotional abuse he suffered from his mother, created a perfect storm of psychological damage that would shape his development into a killer. Clarnell's treatment of Edmund was particularly damaging. She was not just neglectful but actively abusive, both emotionally and physically. She constantly criticized him, calling him stupid, ugly, and worthless. She made him feel ashamed of his height and physical appearance, telling him that he looked like a freak and that no woman would ever want him. This constant verbal abuse destroyed his self-esteem and created deep feelings of rage and resentment that would later drive his violent behavior. The physical abuse was just as damaging as the emotional abuse. Clarnell would lock Edmund in the basement at night, telling him that she was afraid he might harm his sisters while they slept. This isolation was both humiliating and terrifying for a young child. The basement was dark and frightening, and being locked down there made Edmund feel like a prisoner in his own home. This treatment reinforced his feelings of being different and dangerous, and it created a deep sense of abandonment and rejection. Clarnell's fear that Edmund might harm his sisters was based on her recognition that something was seriously wrong with him. She had seen his cruelty toward animals and his disturbing games, and she was genuinely afraid of what he might do. However, rather than getting him proper psychological help, she chose to isolate and punish him, which only made his problems worse. The isolation in the basement also contributed to Edmund's developing fantasy life. Alone in the dark, he would spend hours thinking about violence and death. He would imagine scenarios where he had power and control over others, particularly women. These fantasies became more elaborate and more violent over time, creating the mental framework that would eventually drive his crimes. When Edmund was 9 years old, his parents' marriage finally collapsed completely. The constant fighting and tension had made the household unbearable for everyone involved. Clarnell decided to divorce her husband and take the children with her. This was a devastating blow to Edmund, who despite everything had maintained a close relationship with his father. Edmund Sr. was the one stable, positive influence in his life, and losing him was traumatic. After the divorce, Clarnell moved the children to Montana, where she had family connections. This move further destabilized Edmund's life by removing him from any familiar surroundings and support systems he might have had. The move to Montana also meant that Edmund would have even less contact with his father, deepening his sense of abandonment and loss. Life in Montana with his mother was extremely difficult. Clarnell's alcoholism got worse after the divorce, and her treatment of Edmund became even more abusive. She blamed him for many of the family's problems and made it clear that she saw him as a burden and a source of shame. She would often tell him that he was just like his father, which she meant as an insult, and that he would never amount to anything. The combination of the divorce, the move, and his mother's increasing abuse pushed Edmund further into isolation and fantasy. He became even more withdrawn from other people and spent increasing amounts of time alone with his violent thoughts and fantasies. He had few friends and struggled to form normal social relationships. His size and awkward personality made him stand out in negative ways, and other children often avoided him or made fun of him. At school, Edmund's teachers noticed that something was wrong, but they did not understand the full extent of his problems. He was intelligent and could be well-behaved when he wanted to be, but there was something unsettling about him that made adults uncomfortable. His classmates found him strange and threatening, and he had difficulty forming friendships or participating in normal childhood activities. As Edmund entered his teenage years, the problems that had been developing since childhood became more pronounced and more dangerous. His fantasies about violence and control became more elaborate and more focused on sexual themes. He began to develop the psychological patterns that would eventually drive him to murder. The relationship with his mother continued to deteriorate as Edmund got older and bigger. By the time he was a teenager, he was already over 6 feet tall and continued growing. His imposing physical presence made Clarnell even more uncomfortable around him, but instead of trying to address his psychological problems, she increased her verbal and emotional abuse. She would mock his appearance and tell him that he was too big and clumsy, that he scared people, and that no woman would ever want to be with him. This constant criticism about his appearance and social prospects was particularly damaging because it reinforced Edmund's feelings of inadequacy and rejection. He desperately wanted to have relationships with women, but his mother's words convinced him that he was too repulsive and frightening for any woman to love him. This created a cycle of desire and despair that would eventually contribute to his violent behavior toward women. The tension between Edmund and his mother reached a breaking point when he was 14 years old. Unable to stand living with her any longer, he decided to run away and try to reunite with his father. This was a desperate attempt to escape the toxic environment his mother had created and to reconnect with the one person who had shown him love and acceptance. Edmund managed to make his way from Montana to Van Nuys, California, where his father was living. He was hoping that his father would take him in and that they could rebuild their relationship. However, when he arrived at his father's house, he discovered that his father had remarried and now had a stepson. Edmund Sr. had moved on with his life and was not prepared to take responsibility for his troubled teenage son. The reunion with his father was not what Edmund had hoped for. While his father was not cruel to him, it was clear that there was no place for Edmund in his new family. His father had his own life and responsibilities now, and taking in a troubled teenager would have complicated his new marriage and family situation. After allowing Edmund to stay for a short time, his father made arrangements for him to go live with his paternal grandparents in North Fork, California. This rejection by his father was another devastating blow to Edmund's already fragile psychological state. The person he had counted on as his potential savior had essentially abandoned him just as his mother had. This reinforced his feelings that he was unwanted and unloved, and it contributed to his growing rage and resentment toward the world. Edmund's grandparents, Edmund Emil Kemper Sr. and Maud Matilda Huey Kemper, were elderly people who were not prepared to deal with a troubled teenager. They lived on a ranch in the rural community of North Fork, where they had hoped to spend their retirement years in peace. Taking in their troubled grandson was not something they had planned for or wanted to do, but they felt obligated to help when their son asked them to. The living situation with his grandparents was difficult from the beginning. Edmund was a large, troubled teenager with serious psychological problems, and his grandparents were not equipped to deal with him. They had been born in the 1890s and had very different ideas about child rearing and discipline than what might have been appropriate for someone with Edmund's problems. Maud Kemper, in particular, reminded Edmund of his mother in many ways. She was critical and controlling, and she did not hesitate to let Edmund know when she disapproved of his behavior. She would scold him for minor infractions and make it clear that she found him difficult and burdensome. This treatment was painfully similar to what he had experienced with his mother, and it triggered the same feelings of rage and resentment. Edmund's grandfather was less directly abusive, but he was also not particularly warm or supportive. He was an elderly man who was set in his ways and did not understand how to deal with a troubled teenager. He expected Edmund to conform to their quiet, orderly lifestyle, but Edmund's psychological problems made this difficult. Living on the isolated ranch also contributed to Edmund's problems. He had even fewer opportunities for social interaction than he had before, and the isolation allowed his violent fantasies to continue developing without any external intervention. He spent long hours alone with his thoughts, building elaborate mental scenarios in which he had power and control over others. The situation with his grandparents continued to deteriorate over the months Edmund lived with them. He felt trapped and unwanted, just as he had with his mother. He was approaching his 16th birthday and was becoming increasingly aware that he was different from other people in dangerous ways. His violent fantasies were becoming more intense and more focused, and he was beginning to think seriously about acting on them. The final crisis came on August 27, 1964, when Edmund was 15 years old. On that day, he and his grandmother got into an argument while they were sitting at the kitchen table. The argument was about something relatively minor, but it triggered all of the rage and resentment that had been building up inside Edmund for years. Unable to control his anger any longer, he stormed out of the kitchen. Edmund went to get the rifle that his grandfather had given him for hunting. This was a .22 caliber rifle that his grandfather had thought might help Edmund develop some responsibility and outdoor skills. Instead, it became the weapon Edmund would use to commit his first murders. Edmund returned to the kitchen where his grandmother was still sitting at the table. Without warning, he raised the rifle and shot her in the head. His grandmother's last words were reportedly, "Oh, you'd better not be shooting the birds again," showing that she had no idea what was about to happen to her. After shooting her in the head, Edmund fired 2 more shots into her back to make sure she was dead. Some accounts suggest that Edmund also stabbed his grandmother multiple times with a kitchen knife after shooting her, showing the level of rage and violence that had been unleashed. This was not a crime of passion or a moment of temporary insanity, but rather the culmination of years of psychological development toward violence. After killing his grandmother, Edmund had to decide what to do next. He knew that when his grandfather returned from grocery shopping, he would discover the body and call the police. Edmund could not allow this to happen, so he decided that he would have to kill his grandfather as well. When Edmund Sr. returned from his shopping trip, Edmund was waiting for him. As his grandfather got out of his car in the driveway, Edmund shot and killed him. This second murder was more calculated than the first, showing that Edmund was capable of planning and executing violence in a methodical way. After killing both of his grandparents, Edmund was unsure what to do next. He called his mother and told her what had happened. When she asked him why he had done it, his response was chilling in its simplicity. "I just wondered how it would feel to shoot Grandma." He explained that he had killed his grandfather so that the older man would not have to suffer the pain of finding his wife's body. This explanation revealed several important things about Edmund's psychological state. First, it showed that the murders had been driven by curiosity about killing rather than by anger or revenge. This suggested that Edmund was already developing the cold, calculating mindset that would characterize his later crimes. Second, his claimed concern for his grandfather's feelings showed that he was capable of some level of empathy, but only in a twisted, self-serving way. Edmund's mother told him to call the police and turn himself in, which he did. He waited calmly for the authorities to arrive and arrest him. When the police came, he confessed immediately and provided a detailed account of what he had done. This willingness to confess would become a pattern in Edmund's criminal behavior, suggesting that part of him wanted to be caught and stopped. The murders of his grandparents marked a turning point in Edmund's life. At 15 years old, he had crossed the line from troubled teenager to actual killer. The psychological barriers that prevent most people from committing murder had been broken, and Edmund had discovered that he was capable of taking human life without overwhelming remorse or psychological breakdown. The legal system was not sure how to handle such a young killer. Edmund was evaluated by court psychiatrists who diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia. This diagnosis was based on his bizarre behavior, his lack of appropriate emotional responses, and his apparent disconnection from reality. The psychiatrists concluded that Edmund was not capable of standing trial as an adult and that he needed intensive psychiatric treatment. Rather than being sent to a juvenile detention facility, Edmund was committed to Atascadero State Hospital, a maximum security psychiatric facility that specialized in treating the criminally insane. This decision would prove to be crucial in Edmund's development, as it gave him access to psychological knowledge and techniques that he would later use to manipulate others. Atascadero State Hospital was considered one of the most advanced facilities of its kind in the country. It had been designed with the philosophy that even the most dangerous criminals could be rehabilitated through proper psychiatric treatment. The facility emphasized therapy over punishment and gave patients significant freedom and privileges compared to traditional prisons. When Edmund arrived at Atascadero in 1964, he was one of the youngest patients the facility had ever housed. At just 15 years old, he was surrounded by adult criminals and psychiatric patients, many of whom had committed far more serious crimes than his own. This environment exposed Edmund to criminal thinking and behavior patterns that would influence his own development. Despite his young age, Edmund quickly adapted to life at Atascadero. He was intelligent and articulate, and he learned how to present himself in ways that impressed the staff. He became a model patient, following rules, participating in therapy sessions, and showing apparent progress in his treatment. The staff began to see him as a success story, a troubled young man who was responding well to their therapeutic approach. One of the most significant aspects of Edmund's time at Atascadero was his involvement in psychological testing. Under the supervision of Dr. Frank Vanasek, the research director at the facility, Edmund learned to administer psychological tests to other patients. This gave him unprecedented access to psychological knowledge and testing procedures that he would later use to manipulate mental health professionals. By learning how psychological tests worked and what responses were considered normal or abnormal, Edmund gained the ability to fake mental health and stability. He could provide the answers that would make him appear rehabilitated and ready for release, even when his underlying psychological problems remained unchanged. This knowledge would prove crucial in his eventual release from the facility. Edmund's intelligence was formally measured during his time at Atascadero, and the results were remarkable. His first IQ test showed a score of 136, which placed him in the highly gifted range. A later test showed an even higher score of 145, putting him near genius level. This high intelligence made Edmund particularly dangerous because it gave him the ability to plan and execute complex crimes while avoiding detection. The combination of high intelligence and psychological knowledge made Edmund extremely skilled at manipulation. He learned to tell mental health professionals exactly what they wanted to hear, and he became expert at presenting himself as reformed and stable. He could discuss his crimes in what appeared to be a rational, remorseful way that convinced the staff that he had gained insight into his behavior and was no longer dangerous. During his 5 years at Atascadero, Edmund's physical development continued at a remarkable pace. He grew to his full adult height of 6 feet 9 inches and weighed close to 300 pounds by the time of his release. This imposing physical presence would later be crucial in his ability to overpower victims and intimidate others. The psychiatric staff at Atascadero eventually concluded that Edmund's original diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia had been incorrect. They reclassified him as having a personality trait disturbance, passive-aggressive type, which was considered a much less serious condition. This reclassification was based on their observation that Edmund did not show signs of psychosis or disorganized thinking, which are key symptoms of schizophrenia. This diagnostic change was crucial in Edmund's eventual release. Schizophrenia was considered a serious, chronic mental illness that would require long-term treatment, while a personality disorder was seen as something that could be managed with proper therapy and support. The staff believed that Edmund had learned to control his aggressive impulses and was ready to re-enter society. The decision to release Edmund was also influenced by his apparent cooperation with treatment and his intellectual abilities. The staff saw him as someone who had gained genuine insight into his problems and was committed to living a law-abiding life. They believed that his intelligence would help him succeed in the outside world and that he would be able to manage his psychological issues. On December 18, 1969, Edmund's 21st birthday, he was released from Atascadero State Hospital. The timing of his release was not coincidental. California law required that juvenile offenders be released when they reached the age of majority, regardless of their crimes. The psychiatric staff had declared him rehabilitated, and legally there was no basis for continuing to hold him. The conditions of Edmund's release required him to live with his mother, who is now living in Santa Cruz, California. This requirement would prove to be disastrous, as it placed Edmund back in the toxic relationship that had contributed to his original psychological problems. The psychiatric staff had actually advised against this arrangement, but there were limited alternatives available. Clarnell had remarried and was now known as Clarnell Strandberg, but her personality and behavior had not changed. She was still the same critical, domineering woman who had made Edmund's childhood miserable. When Edmund arrived to live with her, she immediately began the same pattern of verbal abuse and criticism that had characterized their earlier relationship. Living with his mother again was extremely difficult for Edmund. He was now a large, imposing man, but emotionally, he was still the damaged child who had been rejected and abused for years. the old patterns of conflict and resentment quickly reasserted themselves, creating a volatile situation that would eventually lead to tragedy. Clarnell was unhappy with Edmund's presence in her home and made no effort to hide her feelings. She criticized his appearance, his lack of employment, and his social skills. She told him that he was an embarrassment to her and that she was ashamed to have him as a son. This constant criticism reopened all of the psychological wounds from his childhood and reactivated the rage and resentment that had driven him to kill his grandparents. Edmund attempted to find work and establish some independence, but his criminal record and psychological history made this difficult. He applied for various jobs, including a position as a state trooper, but was rejected due to his size and background. These rejections reinforced his feelings of inadequacy and failure, contributing to his growing frustration and anger. The relationship between Edmund and his mother quickly deteriorated to the point where they were arguing constantly. Neighbors later reported that they could hear them fighting loudly and frequently. Edmund felt trapped in the same toxic dynamic that had plagued his childhood, while Clarnell seemed unable to change her behavior despite knowing about Edmund's history of violence. During this period, Edmund's violent fantasies began to intensify and become more focused. He started thinking seriously about acting on his violent impulses again, but this time his targets would be different. Instead of family members, he began to fantasize about killing young women, particularly college students. The Santa Cruz area provided Edmund with plenty of potential targets. The University of California at Santa Cruz had opened in 1965 and was attracting thousands of students to the area. Many of these students were young women who frequently hitchhiked around the area, making them vulnerable to predators like Edmund. Edmund's choice of victims was not random. Young, attractive college women represented everything that he felt had been denied to him. They had the kind of life and opportunities that he believed he deserved but could never have. They were also symbols of the female rejection and criticism that had defined his relationship with his mother and had caused him so much psychological pain. Edmund began to prepare for his crimes in a systematic way. He started driving around the Santa Cruz area, familiarizing himself with the locations where young women hitchhiked and identifying secluded areas where he could take victims without being observed. He also began to think about the methods he would use to kill and dispose of bodies. The planning phase of Edmund's crime showed the level of intelligence and calculation that he brought to his criminal activities. Unlike many serial killers who act impulsively, Edmund thought through every aspect of his crimes in advance. He considered how to approach victims, how to gain their trust, how to kill them quickly and efficiently, and how to dispose of evidence. Edmund's first opportunity came on May 7, 1972, when he encountered two 18-year-old hitchhiking students from Fresno State University. Mary and Pesci and Anita Mary Luchessa were trying to get to Stanford University to visit friends when Edmund picked them up in Berkeley. They were typical college students, young, attractive, and trusting, exactly the kind of victims Edmund had been fantasizing about. Edmund was skilled at presenting himself as harmless and trustworthy. Despite his imposing size, he could be charming and articulate when he wanted to be. Mary and Anita had no reason to suspect that they were getting into a car with a killer. They chatted amiably with Edmund as he drove, apparently believing that he was just a helpful stranger giving them a ride. Edmund had no intention of taking the young women to their intended destination. Instead, he drove to a secluded wooded area near Alameda that he had identified during his planning phase. This was a remote location where he could carry out his crimes without being interrupted or observed. Once he reached the secluded area, Edmund's demeanor changed completely. The friendly, helpful driver disappeared, and the cold-blooded killer emerged. He handcuffed Mary and Pesci and forced Anita Luchessa into the trunk of his car. This methodical approach showed that Edmund had planned every detail of the attack. Edmund later confessed that while handcuffing Mary he accidentally brushed against one of her breasts, which embarrassed him enough that he apologized to her even as he was preparing to murder her. This strange combination of politeness and violence showed the complex psychological dynamics that drove Edmund's behavior. Edmund stabbed and strangled Mary and Pesci to death in the back seat of his car. He then turned his attention to Anita Luchessa, whom he killed in a similar manner while she was trapped in the trunk. The murders were carried out quickly and efficiently, showing that Edmund was not interested in prolonging his victim's suffering. His primary goal was to obtain corpses that he could use for his sexual fantasies. After killing both young women, Edmund put their bodies in the trunk of his car and drove back toward his apartment. On the way, He was stopped by a police officer for having a broken taillight. This was an incredibly close call that could have ended Edmund's criminal career before it really began, but the officer did not suspect anything and allowed Edmund to continue on his way. The fact that Edmund was able to remain calm and composed during this police stop while he had 2 corpses in his trunk showed his remarkable ability to compartmentalize and control his emotions when necessary. This would prove to be a crucial skill throughout his criminal career. When Edmund reached his apartment, his roommate was not home, giving him privacy to carry out the next phase of his crimes. He brought the bodies inside and engaged in necrophilia with both corpses. This was the primary motivation for his murders, not the killing itself, but the sexual access to bodies that could not reject him or criticize him. Edmund also photographed the bodies, creating a record of his crimes that he could use later for sexual gratification. This behavior showed that the murders were not just about immediate sexual satisfaction, but also about creating lasting memories and trophies that he could revisit. After having sex with the corpses, Edmund dismembered the bodies using knives from his kitchen. He was methodical and thorough in this process, showing no emotional reaction to the gruesome work. He cut the bodies into pieces and packaged them in plastic bags for disposal. Edmund disposed of the body parts at various locations near Loma Prieta Mountain. He was careful to scatter the remains across a wide area to make it difficult for authorities to recover them and piece together what had happened. Before disposing of the heads, however, Edmund engaged in oral sex with them, showing the full extent of his necrophilic behavior. The disposal of the remains showed Edmund's intelligence and planning ability. He chose locations that were remote and difficult to search, and he took care to avoid leaving evidence that could be traced back to him. Most of the remains were never recovered, although Mary and Pesci's skull was found in August 1972. After committing these first murders, Edmund returned to his normal life as if nothing had happened. He continued to live with his mother and look for work, showing no outward signs of what he had done. This ability to compartmentalize his criminal behavior and maintain a normal facade was one of the things that made him so dangerous. Edmund's success with his first murders reinforced his belief that he could kill without being caught. The experience had satisfied his violent and sexual fantasies in ways that masturbation and fantasy alone could not. He began to think about when and how he would kill again. The period between Edmund's first murders and his next crime showed his patience and self-control. He did not kill again for several months, suggesting that he was not driven by an uncontrollable compulsion, but rather by a calculated desire to repeat the experience when the opportunity was right. On September 14, 1972, Edmund encountered his next victim. Aiko Ku was a 15-year-old girl who had missed her bus to a dance class in San Francisco. She was hitchhiking when Edmund picked her up, making her an easy target for his predatory behavior. Aiko was younger than Edmund's previous victims, but she fit his preferred victim type, a young, attractive female who was vulnerable due to her need for transportation. Like his previous victims, she had no reason to suspect that Edmund was dangerous and trusted him to take her where she wanted to go. Edmund drove Aiko to a secluded area and pulled a gun on her, showing that he was becoming more confident and aggressive in his approach to victims. He did not need to use elaborate ruses or deception. He could simply overpower his victims through size and weapons. Edmund strangled Aiko to death and then sexually assaulted her corpse. This pattern of quick murder followed by necrophilia was becoming his established method of operation. He was not interested in torturing or terrorizing his victims while they were alive. He wanted them dead so that he could use their bodies for his sexual gratification. After killing Aiko, Edmund demonstrated his remarkable coldness and composure by driving to a local bar called the Jury Room, where he socialized and drank with off-duty police officers. This showed his incredible ability to compartmentalize his behavior and maintain a normal social facade even immediately after committing murder. The fact that Edmund chose to socialize with police officers after committing murder showed both his arrogance and his psychological need to feel superior to the authorities who were supposedly hunting for the killer. He enjoyed the irony of drinking with the very people who would arrest him if they knew what he had just done. Edmund later took Aiko's corpse back to his apartment, where he had sex with it again and then dismembered the body. He disposed of the remains in the California mountains, and unlike his previous victims, none of Aiko's remains have ever been recovered. The murder of Aiko Koo showed that Edmund was becoming more confident and systematic in his approach to killing. He was refining his methods and becoming more efficient at selecting, killing, and disposing of victims. This suggested that he was likely to continue killing until he was stopped. Edmund's next victim was 19-year-old Cindy Shaw, whom he picked up on January 8, 1973. Cindy was a student at Cabrillo College who was hitchhiking when Edmund offered her a ride. Like his previous victims, she had no reason to suspect danger and accepted the ride trustingly. Edmund drove Cindy to a secluded location and shot her in the head with his .22 caliber pistol. This showed that he was continuing to refine his methods, choosing the most efficient way to kill his victims quickly. He then took her body back to his mother's house, where he had more privacy and space to carry out his post-mortem activities. At his mother's house, Edmund put Cindy's corpse in his closet and later moved it to the bathtub, where he had sex with it and then dismembered the body. The fact that he was carrying out these activities in his mother's house while she was present showed his incredible boldness and confidence that he would not be discovered. Edmund disposed of most of Cindy's remains by throwing them off a cliff, but he kept her head for a special purpose. He buried it in the backyard of his mother's house, positioned so that it was facing up toward his mother's bedroom window. When asked about this later, Edmund explained that he wanted his victims to look up to his mother. This symbolic gesture showed the complex psychological dynamics that were driving Edmund's crimes. His murders were not just about sexual gratification, but also about expressing his rage and resentment toward his mother. By burying a victim's head in the yard where it would symbolically watch his mother, Edmund was making a twisted statement about power and control. The discovery of Cindy's other remains over the following weeks created significant concern among law enforcement and the public. It was becoming clear that a serial killer was operating in the Santa Cruz area, and young women were being warned to be careful about accepting rides from strangers. Edmund's next murders occurred on February 5, 1973, and involved two victims. After having an argument with his mother, Edmund left the house in an angry mood and went looking for victims. His emotional state on this day showed how his relationship with his mother continued to fuel his violent impulses. The University of California at Santa Cruz had begun advising students to only accept rides from vehicles that displayed university parking stickers, believing this would protect them from predators. However, Edmund was able to obtain a university sticker because his mother worked at the university, giving him the perfect cover to approach potential victims. Edmund separately encountered 23-year-old Rosalind Thorpe and 20-year-old Alice Liu on the university campus. Rosalind entered his car first, believing Edmund to be a fellow student because of the university sticker. She began chatting with him in a friendly manner as they drove, having no idea of the danger she was in. When Edmund saw Alice Liu hitchhiking, he stopped and picked her up as well. This gave him two victims in one day, doubling the potential satisfaction from his crimes. With both young women in his car, Edmund drove away from the campus area toward a secluded location where he could kill them. Edmund shot Rosalind Thorpe in the head with his pistol while they were still in the car. When Alice Liu realized what was happening, she tried to escape, but Edmund turned the gun on her as well. His first two shots missed the terrified young woman, but his third shot hit her in the temple. He continued shooting to make sure both victims were dead. Edmund wrapped both bodies in blankets and drove back to his mother's house with the corpses. This time, he beheaded both victims in his car before bringing the headless bodies into the house. This showed that he was becoming even more systematic and efficient in his methods. Edmund had sexual intercourse with both headless corpses and then dismembered the bodies completely. He removed the bullets from the victims' heads to prevent ballistic identification and then disposed of the remains at various locations the next morning. Some of the remains were discovered at Eden Canyon a week later, and more were found near Route 1 in March. When questioned later about why he decapitated his victims, Edmund provided insight into his psychological motivations. He explained that the head was like a trophy because it contained everything that made a person who they were: the brain, eyes, and mouth. He saw decapitation as a way of possessing the most important part of his victims. The double murder of Rosalind Thorpe and Alice Liu marked the peak of Edmund's killing spree. He had now murdered 6 young women in less than a year, and his crimes were becoming increasingly bold and systematic. The frequency of his murders suggested that he was accelerating towards some kind of climax or breakdown. During this period, The Santa Cruz area was being terrorized not just by Edmund, but by two other serial killers as well. John Linley Frazier had killed 5 people in 1970, and Herbert Mullen was in the midst of his own killing spree that would eventually claim 13 victims. This concentration of serial killers in one area led to Santa Cruz being called the murder capital of the world by the press. The presence of multiple killers actually helped Edmund avoid detection because law enforcement was overwhelmed trying to investigate multiple series of murders simultaneously. The different methods and victim types used by each killer made it difficult to determine which murders were connected, giving Edmund additional cover for his crimes. Edmund was becoming increasingly confident in his ability to kill without being caught. He had murdered 6 young women and disposed of their bodies without leaving evidence that could be traced back to him. He was even socializing with police officers who were investigating his crimes, giving him a sense of superiority and invulnerability. However, Edmund's relationship with his mother was continuing to deteriorate, and this would eventually lead to the climax of his criminal career. The constant arguments and verbal abuse were taking their toll on Edmund's psychological stability, and he was beginning to think about more permanent solutions to his problems. The situation came to a head in April 1973, during the Easter weekend. Edmund and his mother had been arguing more frequently and more intensely, and Edmund was reaching the end of his ability to tolerate the situation. He knew that his killing spree would eventually be discovered, and he did not want his mother to suffer the shame and humiliation that would come with having a serial killer for a son. On the evening of April 20th, 1973, Good Friday, Edmund and his mother had another heated argument. Clarnell went to bed angry, having no idea that this would be the last night of her life. Edmund waited until he was sure she was asleep, and then went into her bedroom carrying a claw hammer. Edmund struck his mother in the head with the hammer while she slept, killing her instantly. He then used a penknife to cut her throat, making sure she was dead. This murder was different from his previous crimes because it was driven by personal rage and resentment rather than sexual fantasy. After killing his mother, Edmund decapitated her and removed her hands, following the same pattern he had used with his other victims. However, he also did something unique with his mother's body. He removed her larynx and put it down the garbage disposal. When asked about this later, Edmund said it was symbolic because his mother had used her voice to hurt him throughout his life. Edmund also engaged in sexual activity with his mother's severed head, showing that even this most personal murder had sexual components. He then used the head as a dartboard, throwing darts at it in a final expression of his rage and contempt. After hiding his mother's body parts throughout the house, Edmund called his mother's best friend, Sally Hallett, and invited her over for dinner and a movie. This showed his continued ability to appear normal and friendly even immediately after committing murder. When Sally Hallett arrived at the house, Edmund strangled her to death as well. This murder was necessary to support his plan to make it appear that both women had gone on vacation together. He also decapitated Sally and spent the night with her corpse, showing that his necrophilic behavior extended even to this opportunistic killing. The murders of his mother and her friend marked the end of Edmund's killing spree. These final murders were different from his previous crimes because they were more personal and emotional, driven by specific rage rather than generalized sexual fantasy. They also showed that Edmund was capable of long-term planning and deception, as he had clearly thought about how to cover up the crimes. After committing these final murders, Edmund stole Sally's car and fled the area. He drove eastward across the country, eventually reaching Pueblo, Colorado. During this time, he was waiting to hear news reports about the discovery of the bodies, but when no news came, he realized that the bodies had not yet been found. On April 23, 1973, Edmund made a decision that surprised law enforcement and ended his criminal career. He called the Santa Cruz Police Department from a payphone in Pueblo and confessed to the murders of his mother and Sally Hallett. He also claimed responsibility for the murders of the 6 college students, providing details that only the killer could know. The police initially thought the call was a prank because they knew Edmund as Big Ed, a friendly giant who often socialized with officers at local bars. The idea that this harmless-seeming man could be the co-ed killer seemed impossible to believe. However, Edmund persisted in his confession and provided enough details to convince them that he was telling the truth. Edmund's decision to confess was driven by several factors. First, he knew that the discovery of his mother's body would inevitably lead to his identification as the killer. Second, he may have been psychologically exhausted by the stress of maintaining his double life. Finally, There may have been part of him that wanted to be caught and stopped before he killed again. Edmund waited patiently by the payphone until Colorado authorities came to arrest him. He was calm and cooperative during the arrest, showing no signs of resistance or regret. He was extradited back to California to face charges for his crimes. During his interrogation, Edmund confessed in detail to all of his murders. He provided information about his methods, his motivations, and the locations where he had disposed of evidence. His confessions were remarkable for their matter-of-fact tone and complete lack of remorse or emotion. Edmund's trial began in October 1973, and it attracted significant media attention due to the shocking nature of his crimes. He was charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of the 6 college students, his mother, and Sally Hallett. The murders of his grandparents were not included because he had already been convicted and sentenced for those crimes as a juvenile. Edmund's defense attorney attempted to argue that he was not guilty by reason of insanity, but this strategy failed. The psychiatrists who evaluated Edmund concluded that while he had serious personality disorders, he was legally sane and understood the nature and consequences of his actions. His high intelligence and careful planning actually worked against an insanity defense. During the trial, Edmund testified in his own defense and provided chilling insights into his psychological state and motivations. He spoke about his crimes in a calm, analytical way that horrified observers. He showed no remorse for his victims and seemed more interested in explaining his actions than in expressing regret for them. The prosecution had little difficulty proving Edmund's guilt, as he had already confessed to the crimes and provided detailed information about how they were committed. The physical evidence, while limited due to Edmund's careful disposal methods, supported his confessions. The jury deliberated for only a short time before finding him guilty on all counts. When the judge asked Edmund what he thought would be an appropriate punishment for his crimes, Edmund's response was characteristically shocking. He said that he deserved death by torture, showing his understanding of the severity of his actions, but also his desire to maintain control over his own fate. However, California had suspended capital punishment at the time of Edmund's trial, so the death penalty was not available. Instead, he was sentenced to 8 concurrent life sentences without the possibility of parole. He was sent to the California Medical Facility in Vacaville, where he has remained incarcerated ever since. Edmund's case had a significant impact on law enforcement and psychology. His high intelligence, careful planning, and ability to manipulate mental health professionals challenged existing ideas about serial killers and criminal psychology. His detailed confessions provided valuable insights into the mind of a serial killer that helped inform future investigations and profiling techniques. The case also highlighted the dangers of releasing violent criminals, even those who appeared to be rehabilitated. Edmund had convinced the staff at Atascadero that he was cured and ready to re-enter society, but his later crimes showed that his fundamental psychological problems had not been addressed. This led to changes in how mental health professionals evaluate the risk of violence in patients. Edmund's relationship with his mother became a case study in how childhood abuse and trauma can contribute to the development of violent behavior. While his mother's abuse did not excuse his crimes, it provided important insights into the factors that can create a serial killer. This understanding has been used to develop better intervention programs for at-risk children. In prison, Edmund has been considered a model inmate for most of his incarceration. He has participated in various programs and activities and has generally followed prison rules. However, he has also waived his right to parole hearings multiple times, stating that he believes society is not ready for his release and that he is happy in prison. Edmund's high intelligence has made him a valuable subject for researchers studying criminal psychology. He has participated in numerous interviews and studies over the years, providing insights into his crimes and psychological state. His articulate explanations of his behavior have been both fascinating and disturbing to researchers. Despite his cooperation with researchers and his apparently good behavior in prison, Edmund remains extremely dangerous. Recent psychological evaluations have concluded that he still poses a high risk of violence if released. His lack of genuine remorse and his continued focus on his own needs and desires suggest that his fundamental personality has not changed. Edmund's case continues to be studied by criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement professionals. His crimes represent a perfect storm of factors: high intelligence, childhood trauma, mental illness, and opportunity, that combined to create one of the most dangerous serial killers in American history. The victims of Edmund's crimes were young women with their whole lives ahead of them. Mary and Pesci, Anita Luchessa, Aiko Koo, Cindy Shaw, Rosalind Thorpe, and Alice Liu were all students or young people pursuing their education and dreams when they encountered Edmund. Their deaths cut short promising lives and caused immeasurable pain to their families and friends. The impact of Edmund's crimes extended far beyond his immediate victims. The families of the murdered women suffered devastating losses that affected them for the rest of their lives. The Santa Cruz community was terrorized by the knowledge that a killer was targeting young women, changing how people lived their daily lives and trusted strangers. Edmund's crimes also had broader social implications, contributing to changes in how women approached personal safety and how society viewed the dangers facing young people. The hitchhiking culture of the 1970s was significantly affected by cases like Edmund's, as people became more aware of the risks involved in accepting rides from strangers. The investigation of Edmund's crimes also revealed weaknesses in law enforcement coordination and communication. The presence of multiple serial killers in the same area overwhelmed local resources and made it difficult to identify patterns and connections between crimes. This led to improvements in how multiple jurisdictions work together on complex cases. Edmund's case also influenced the development of criminal profiling techniques. His high intelligence and careful planning challenge existing assumptions about serial killers and help law enforcement develop better methods for identifying and catching similar criminals. The FBI's behavioral science unit used Edmund's case as one of their foundational studies. The psychological aspects of Edmund's case have been extensively studied and have contributed to our understanding of how serial killers develop and operate. His childhood trauma, relationship with his mother, and progression from animal cruelty to human murder have become textbook examples of the factors that can create a killer. Edmund's ability to manipulate mental health professionals has also been an important area of study. His success in convincing the staff at Atascadero that he was rehabilitated highlighted the need for better assessment tools and techniques for evaluating violent offenders. This has led to improvements in risk assessment procedures. The necrophilic aspects of Edmund's crimes have also been studied as examples of extreme sexual pathology. His preference for dead bodies over living partners revealed deep-seated psychological issues that went far beyond normal sexual dysfunction. This has contributed to our understanding of sexual homicide and its psychological roots. Edmund's intelligence and articulateness have made him a unique subject for psychological study. Unlike many serial killers who are unable or unwilling to explain their behavior, Edmund has provided detailed, analytical descriptions of his crimes and motivations. While these explanations must be viewed with skepticism due to his manipulative nature, they have provided valuable insights. The media coverage of Edmund's case helped establish many of the stereotypes and expectations that surround serial killers in popular culture. His combination of intelligence, physical imposingness, and articulate explanations of his crimes created a template that has been replicated in countless books, movies, and television shows about serial killers. Edmund's case also highlighted the importance of early intervention in cases of childhood violence and abuse. The warning signs were present throughout his childhood: animal cruelty, violent fantasies, disturbing games, and family dysfunction, but were not addressed effectively. This has led to increased awareness of the need to identify and help at-risk children. The failure of the mental health system to properly treat Edmund has also been an important lesson for professionals in the field. Despite 5 years of treatment at a prestigious facility, Edmund's underlying problems were not resolved. This has led to questions about the effectiveness of traditional therapeutic approaches for certain types of violent offenders. Edmund's relationship with law enforcement during his crimes has also been studied as an example of how killers can hide in plain sight. His socializing with police officers who were investigating his crimes showed how predators can use charm and manipulation to avoid suspicion. This has influenced training for law enforcement on how to identify potential suspects. The geographic aspects of Edmund's crimes have also been analyzed to understand how serial killers choose hunting grounds and disposal sites. His familiarity with the Santa Cruz area from his work with the Highway Department gave him knowledge of remote locations that he used to avoid detection. This has influenced how investigators approach geographic profiling. Edmund's targeting of hitchhiking college students reflected both his victim preferences and his practical considerations. Young women were his preferred targets due to his psychological issues with female rejection, while hitchhikers were easy targets who could be isolated and controlled. This combination of psychological and practical factors is common among serial killers. The timing of Edmund's crimes, occurring during a period of social change and cultural upheaval in the early 1970s, has also been studied as a factor in his ability to operate undetected. The counterculture movement, changing attitudes toward authority, and increased mobility of young people created conditions that serial killers could exploit. Edmund's physical size and strength were crucial factors in his ability to overpower victims and control crime scenes. At 6 feet 9 inches and nearly 300 pounds, he was physically intimidating and capable of subduing victims quickly. This has been studied as an example of how physical attributes can be risk factors for violent behavior. The psychological aftermath of Edmund's crimes for the survivors and families has also been documented and studied. The trauma experienced by those who lost loved ones to his violence has provided insights into the long-term effects of violent crime on communities and families. Edmund's continued incarceration at the California Medical Facility has made him one of the longest-serving inmates in the California prison system. His case has been used to study the effects of long-term incarceration on high-intelligence offenders and the challenges of managing dangerous inmates over decades. The periodic parole hearings for Edmund have become opportunities to reassess his danger level and the effectiveness of his imprisonment. Despite his good behavior in prison, psychological evaluations continue to find him at high risk for violence, supporting the decision to keep him incarcerated. Edmund's case continues to be relevant today as researchers and law enforcement professionals work to understand and prevent similar crimes. His detailed confessions and willingness to discuss his crimes have created a valuable resource for those studying violent behavior and serial killing. The technological advances that have occurred since Edmund's crimes have been applied retroactively to his case, providing new insights into his methods and psychology. Modern forensic techniques and psychological assessment tools have been used to re-examine the evidence and better understand his behavior. Edmund's influence on popular culture has been significant, with his case inspiring numerous books, documentaries, and fictional portrayals. His articulate and intelligent persona has made him a compelling subject for writers and filmmakers interested in exploring the psychology of serial killers. The ethical questions raised by Edmund's case continue to be debated by professionals in law enforcement, psychology, and criminal justice. Issues such as the proper treatment of juvenile offenders, the assessment of rehabilitation, and the balance between punishment and treatment remain relevant today. Edmund's case has also contributed to discussions about the death penalty and life imprisonment. His request for death by torture and his subsequent adaptation to prison life have been used as arguments both for and against capital punishment in cases of serial murder. The international attention that Edmund's case received has made it a reference point for understanding serial killing as a global phenomenon. Researchers in other countries have used his case to compare and contrast with similar crimes in their own jurisdictions. Edmund Kemper's story represents one of the most thoroughly documented and analyzed cases of serial killing in criminal history. From his troubled childhood through his violent crimes to his continued incarceration, every aspect of his life has been examined for insights into the nature of violent behavior and the factors that create killers. The 10 lives that Edmund took cannot be restored, and the pain he caused cannot be undone. However, the knowledge gained from studying his case has contributed to efforts to prevent similar crimes and better understand the complex factors that can turn a human being into a predator. His story serves as both a warning about the dangers that can lurk beneath a seemingly normal exterior and a testament to the importance of early intervention in cases of childhood trauma and violence. Today, Edmund Kemper remains in prison at the age of 75, serving his 8 life sentences at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville. He has been denied parole multiple times and will likely spend the rest of his life in prison. While he has expressed satisfaction with his imprisonment and claims to be happy behind bars, psychological evaluations continue to find him dangerous and unsuitable for release. His case continues to be studied and analyzed by new generations of researchers, law enforcement officers, and mental health professionals. The insights gained from Edmund Kemper's crimes and psychology continue to inform our understanding of serial killing and violent behavior, ensuring that his victims did not die completely in vain if their deaths can help prevent future tragedies. The story of Edmund Kemper is ultimately a story of wasted potential and the devastating consequences of untreated mental illness and childhood trauma. His high intelligence and articulateness could have been used for positive purposes, but instead were turned toward manipulation and violence. His case serves as a reminder of the importance of identifying and helping troubled individuals before they become dangerous to others. Edmund Kemper will be remembered not for any positive contributions to society, but for the 10 lives he took and the fear and suffering he caused. His story stands as one of the darkest chapters in the history of American crime, a cautionary tale about the monster that can be created when intelligence, opportunity, and psychological damage combine in the worst possible way. The final chapter of Edmund Kemper's story has yet to be written, as he remains alive and incarcerated. However, barring any dramatic changes in his psychological state or the legal system, he will likely die in prison, never again to be free to harm another innocent person. His victims, their families, and society as a whole can take some measure of comfort in knowing that justice has been served, even as the scars left by his crime